Well, it's been a while since I've addressed the Middle East. I've been talking so much about finance lately, and so I think I need to, before there's some big news story today, I need to get this out of the way and discuss the ongoing withdrawal from Afghanistan, which seemed to have been going fairly well, and I was getting ready to, do a presentation where I said, hey, Uncle Joe, I'm glad that I was wrong about you. You actually went forward. You did you're doing the withdrawal and all that. But I hadn't done it yet because I was afraid that there might be something that comes up. Because remember what I said when Biden announced that, oh, we're going to delay with the withdrawal, and the media talked about, essentially spun it as, oh, Biden announced that we're going to withdraw from Afghanistan, even though we were supposed to be out in June, and he pushed the date back to September. They somehow spun that as being dovish. Well, now it looks like the withdrawal has stalled. Something I warned about back when Biden announced that he was not going to get out of Afghanistan by the agreed-upon withdrawal date that was in the peace agreement was that the Taliban then, if the U.S. doesn't hold up their end of the deal, the Taliban can't be guaranteed to hold up their end. And the Taliban agreed, hey, we're not going to attack the U.S. Anymore, and the U.S. is going to be out by June. At the end of June, maybe, I think it was, or the beginning of June, I can't remember exactly. But we missed that date. That date came and went, and, hey, what do you know? The Taliban are on the offensive. And they haven't attacked Americans directly, but now the Pentagon, John Kirby, that duplicitous snake from the Obama administration, he's back after a stint as I think he was a CNN contributor during the Trump years. It was just sort of put on the back burner. Is now back at the forefront working at, is he working for the Pentagon or the State Department? I think Kirby might be at the State Department now. And he was saying, we might have to put off this whole withdrawing from Afghanistan thing because, the Taliban, they're being awful naughty. They're not playing nice in the sandbox. They're taking a little too much territory. They're making us look bad. They're not supposed to take over the whole country until we're out. And here they are making us look bad by taking over positions and things and reconquering the country, so quickly while we're still trying to get out. So maybe we'll just stay here and sit, pouting like a petulant child, as if it has ever been any of the United States' business who does or does not rule Afghanistan. And the U.S. has had 20 years now of trying to decide who's going to rule Afghanistan, and they failed to impose any kind of rule on that country. The U.S. has completely failed. You had 20 years to try and install some new regime in Afghanistan, and you can't even get out of the country before it collapses. That's how pathetic the United States is. That's how weak the United States is. And everyone who has died in Afghanistan, make no mistake, whether they're a civilian, whether they're some sort of insurgent or freedom fighter, depending on your perspective. That's what they were called back in the 80s by Ronald Reagan. The Taliban and the like were called freedom fighters. Or whether they're a U.S. soldier. Every single person who died in Afghanistan died for nothing except for the pride and the arrogance of the people in the Pentagon and the State Department and in Washington writ large. They died because our elites are too stubborn to acknowledge that they cannot control every single square mile of this entire planet. And so now I'm going to have to go back to keeping an eye on Afghanistan to see if this whole withdrawal does in fact really happen. It's supposed to be completed by September the 11th. It's supposed to be a big day to celebrate, but we'll see what happens. Hopefully it does. Hopefully Kirby is just bluffing here and blustering, like a jerk for no particular reason other than that. But moving on from Afghanistan, there is another country in the Middle East which the U.S. desperately has wanted to control for decades and has not been able to, which, just enrages the folks in Washington, and that is Iran. Iran, of course, was, they rebelled, I guess, against the British a little bit back in the 50s, and they had some guy who wanted to nationalize the oil fields that were controlled by the British, and the U.S. because the British were too weak. The U.S., helped stage a coup against that guy and made the Shah an absolute monarch in, a role in which he maintained until the late 70s. And then there was another revolution that was not instigated by the U.S., which overthrew the Shah and installed the Ayatollah instead. The Ayatollah, originally got along okay with the U.S. The Ayatollah's real problem was with the Shah. They understood that, the Shah was imposed upon us by the U.S., but that doesn't mean that we can't deal with them. That was a long time ago, back in the 50s. This is the 70s now. The Americans have probably grown up. And that was true. The Americans did try to work with Iran for a bit until the hostage crisis, and ever since then, I guess except for Iran-Contra, the Reagan folks worked with Iran during Iran-Contra, but for most of the time since the Iran hostage crisis, the U.S. and Iran have not gotten along well, and the U.S. has wanted, though has never, I guess, been able to, never taken concrete action or never been able to take concrete action to overthrow the current regime in Iran. And the reason why this is all relevant right now is because the Biden administration is currently trying to renegotiate the U.S.'s re-entrance to the Iran deal, or the JCPOA, as it is officially known, which Obama first got the U.S. into, Trump got the U.S. out of, and now Biden is kind of trying to get the U.S. back into it, but not trying too hard, in that what Iran wants is for the sanctions that Trump put on Iran, the new sanctions, because Iran's always been sanctioned, but Trump put new sanctions on Iran. They want those taken off, because, of course, those sanctions violate the deal. They want the U.S. to take those sanctions off and then just go back to the way things were when Trump came into office. And it doesn't seem like the U.S. really wants to do that. I guess the U.S. wants to take back some of the sanctions and keep some of them on, which, of course, would not comport with the current, language of the deal. I don't think that the Iranians are interested in renegotiating a worse deal for them. And this has all been while the Biden administration has been dealing with, the so-called moderate president, Hassan Rouhani. You have two, when the Western media talks about Iran, you always hear about two factions, the moderates and the hardliners. And now that the so-called moderate guy is out of office, I don't think that and even he did not capitulate to to what the Biden folks were trying to peddle. I highly doubt that a so-called hardliner would be any more receptive to the Biden team's lack of compromise. And considering that the U.S. State Department is slamming this guy's election, which, I think is probably a fair thing to do. I wouldn't call elections in Iran free and fair. I believe that the candidates have to be handpicked, in a sense, by the clergy. So these are all guys who are approved of by the mullahs. So, I'm sure you don't have a huge breadth of choice, but, that's not that different from how the U.S. works. Our elites get to decide who gets to run in the various primaries here in the U.S., and of course, if you run outside of the two major party primaries, you get nowhere. You don't get any screen time. You don't get any publicity. You don't get to participate in presidential debates. It's very hard to get on the ballot in any of the 50 states, let alone all 50 states. And so our elections here are probably just as tightly controlled as they are in Iran. I mean, hell, the one guy who really broke out of that paradigm to where the elite gets to, have an outsized influence in these presidential primaries and essentially make sure that both candidates are people who are loyal to them and to their interests, the various lobbying groups and such. The one guy who was able to beat that out was Trump, and, the entire U.S. establishment that's now condemning Iran, condemned Trump for being outside of, the very narrow paradigm, for being an outsider who was just able to come up through politics organically. And so all their criticisms of Iran for having, this narrow Overton window and these two hand-picked candidates who are both puppets of the ruling class, but sort of different flavors of whatever the mullahs want. It's really hard for me to take my government's criticism seriously. So considering that they don't even consider this guy to be legitimately elected, or at least the fact that they're willing to come out and slam him like that publicly while these negotiations are ongoing, and the guy comes into office, I think, in August, that does not bode well for the Iran deal, renegotiations here. I wouldn't be surprised if nothing comes out of this. Which is surprising, because the Biden administration is supposed to be super anti-Trump, right? And yet you would think that if that were the case, they would be willing to go back to the good old days of Obama and completely reverse everything that Trump had done to Iran and say, hey, let's just go back to the way things were when God King Obama was in office. Isn't that a good thing? And you would think the media would praise him for that. I don't think the media would attack Biden for being soft on Iran if he merely went back to doing what Obama did, because nobody would attack Obama on that. I mean, if you attack Obama for being soft on Iran, what do you think, he's a secret Muslim or something? I mean, that's a crazy conspiracy theory. So that's just about all I have to say on that. I'm concerned about Afghanistan, the direction that that's going, but hopefully that still ends well. As far as Iran goes, I don't have much hope. I would imagine that, and by hope, I mean, it's kind of like, well, it doesn't matter that much either way. Do I think that Biden is going to invade Iran? No, not really. But if Biden keeps tensions ratcheted up with Iran to this same extent that Trump already had him at, it just makes it that much easier. It's that much shorter of a leap for, let's say, you have a really hawkish Republican, like, I don't know, like a Ted Cruz or something that replaces Biden, to come in and say, let's invade Iran, which, of course, would be totally disastrous. And I don't want to get into that right now, but I mean, a disaster so different than the disaster in Iraq. Iran is a massive country with very difficult terrain, a lot of mountains and stuff along the coast or along that line that the U.S. military would have to sort of make their way over in order to invade the country. It's not, a war with Iran is not feasible. And so sanctions as a softer form of warfare really should not be utilized unless you have any intention to go to war in the future. And if you don't have any intention to ever go to war with a country like this, you shouldn't be sanctioning them. You should be trying to get these things off and just figuring out how to resolve your differences in a peaceful manner. If you agree that using force is not going to get you anywhere, because, just sanctions by themselves doesn't do anything. It just makes people mad. I mean, look at the Cuban embargo. What has that done? You say, oh, well, if you just make the lives of the ordinary citizens uncomfortable enough, they'll rise up and overthrow their government for you. Well, that hasn't worked in Cuba. Both, not only did the Cuban regime outlive Castro, it outlived both Castros, and now there's a new guy in there who's not even named Castro, and things are just sort of, bumping along like it's still 1962 or something, or 1972. It's the midst of the Cold War still in Cuba. Everything looks the same. And yet Cuba's been sanctioned by the United States longer than any country. So, with that said, I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.